Okay, this is our first interview with Dad here. He's going to talk about his life and whatever else he wants to.
First and last.
Well, we'll work on the first one and see how he feels about it. Okay, we'll start off simple, I guess. When were you born?
June 3rd, 1933.
And where were you
Columbia,
born?
South Carolina.
Columbia, South Carolina. What?
4815 Main Street. I was born in my own home.
You were born in your own home.
Mm-hmm.
You weren't born in a hospital.
No. I don't remember it, but I happen to know that.
Your mom told you that. So, okay, you're not sure where to go. Your dad, at the time, you were with your real dad and your real mom were together.
Yeah.
Real mom, I mean. So, okay, well, kind of tell me what Columbia, South Carolina. What was your mom doing there? What were your mom and dad? What did he do for a living?
Well, at that time, this was during the Depression, and as best as I know, my mother was doing social work, or was getting into social work. Probably at the time I was born, she may not have been working. And my father had been teaching violin at Columbia College.
That was his main job. I mean,
Yeah, that was his main job.
So he had to be pretty good.
It got to be very problematical because of the Depression. I remember him just telling me recently that they owed him $600, and he went up to get paid, and the Columbia College bursar didn't have the $600 for him, and the bursar himself reached in and gave him $10 out of his own pocket.
Wow.
That was about all they could do, and I don't think they ever did pay him
Well, $600.
In those days, that was a lot of money.
Was a hell of a lot of money.
That was a lot of money, yeah, during the Depression. And my mother later went on to, she got an offer to go to New Orleans and study social work at Tulane University, and that's how she got into it. Whether she was actually working at the time,
But you said she got an offer to go to Tulane. Did she go?
Oh yeah.
I mean, did you all move
After,
there?
no.
You're talking about down?
This is, I think, after they separated.
Oh, okay.
When I was very young.
Well, what happened to you?
At the time she was at Tulane, I'm not sure. I might have stayed with my grandmother.
So she went there and studied for like a year and then came back?
No, I think just for a few months.
Oh, okay. It wasn't okay.
I might have been, left in the care of my uncle and aunt. I'm not sure.
So about when did your parents split up? I mean, when you were 3 or 4?
About by the time I think the marriage was already on the rocks by the time I was born.
Mm-hmm.
And they split up not too long afterward, I suppose. Maybe by the time I was 2.
So you have no
3.
recollection of granddad?
No. I have some vague memories of when I was very young. I remember lying in a crib screaming one time.
Really?
And because I looked up at the ceiling, and as you are when you look up at a tall building, it seemed to be moving. And I remember I was frightened by it, and I started screaming, and all of a sudden he came up and said something like, "What's the matter?" or whatever. He looked over.
Oh, you remember that then?
I remember
so
that.
You had to
That's
be,
the earliest memory I have.
So you must be, you were like 2?
Probably, probably close to 2.
I guess I missed this,
Like
but
that.
you said there was like an earthquake or something was moving?
No, I looked up at the ceiling, how you look up at a tall building and the building seems to be moving.
Okay.
It was that kind of phenomenon.
So you remember him leaning over and looking
I remember his leaning over and saying, "Well, what's the matter?" or something of that sort. And I remember feeling, relieved he was there, but it frightened me just to lie in whatever bed I was in and look up at the ceiling. That's one of the first memories I have.
So you still see his face looking in over at you?
Sort of, yeah.
Mm-hmm. So, then, okay, do you remember, after that, where did y'all were in Columbia, and then we know that she went off to Tulane to study for a few months, and then kind of what happened after that? Where did you all go?
Well, she eventually got a job in Atlanta, and I remember we moved to Atlanta from that house that I was born in, and I was very young.
4 or 5, maybe?
No, I was younger than that, probably 3, maybe 3 and a half. And I remember my Aunt Margaret holding me in her arms, and I remember crying because I knew we were leaving the house. Mm-hmm. And I remember the trip to Atlanta in my mother's car. We had an accident. I was thrown on the floor of the back seat and covered by a bunch of blankets or something. And I remember how the car looked after it had been repaired. It had a wheel sticking out from the edge. I think probably the fender had been taken off. And we lived in Atlanta for some months.
What was she doing?
She was doing social work, I think.
So she was supporting you in Virginia.
Yeah,
I mean,
my sister. I remember calling her at work and calling her Lucille.
why'd you call her Lucille?
I just did. It was one of those little things.
You
For a
never
little
called her
while-
mom?
Well, before and afterward, but for a little while I went through one of these little things where I call her Lucille.
When you were,
About 3.
that's funny.
And then we moved to Cincinnati, and we were there during the
Okay.
Cincinnati flood, so 36, 37.
So you were in Atlanta a few months and you moved to Cincinnati.
Yeah,
Again, she was doing social work up there.
yeah, and she was, and I remember going around with her and seeing the floods along the Ohio River. They had some very drastic floods, and she was doing a lot of social work with the Red Cross and others.
So you were about how old still? It was only a few months, so again about 4, 3, 4?
3.5, maybe not quite 4.
Why'd she leave Atlanta after just being there a few months?
She
didn't
got a
like it?
job, I think. I don't know. She probably got a good job up in Cincinnati.
So how long were you there?
I don't know. Probably less than a year.
You were really moving around a lot.
Yeah. And then we came back to South Carolina, as I recall, or she at least, and then that's when she married my stepfather.
But you were, did you come back to Charleston or Mount Pleasant?
No, we didn't even know. We were still sort of mostly Columbia. I think probably stayed with my grandmother in Ridge Spring, Nanny. And then she went to New York to marry my stepfather, Larry Fouché.
How did she meet him?
I don't know.
You don't know how they met or anything?
No. I think he was working at a gas station at one point. And when she met him, I seem to recall something like that. And he had done some college at the University of South Carolina, but he never finished.
What do you say you think that, I mean, I know there were problems, and we can edit this later if you want, as far as his alcoholism. What was it that attracted her to him? Or what, I mean, there must have been something that...
He was a very manly guy, very, very, very handsome, and very nice personality, very outgoing. He was a very nice guy, and a lot of had a lot of things going for him. And he was very charming, put it that way too. He's a very charming person.
So they got married. She went to, you said, New York to get married, came back, and then where did you all go? So you know how New.
Well, we lived in New York. She went to New York to marry him, and I was put with my uncle Robert and Aunt Naomi, her brother, and his wife. And I think my sister stayed with my grandmother. And then I was in Bristol, Tennessee with them, and they drove me, I guess, to Greenwood to meet my grandmother and my sister, and we were taken to Columbia and put on the train for New York. And then my mother picked us up at the train station. I think she picked us up in Richmond. I think we went as far as Richmond, and she drove down to Richmond and picked us up and drove us back to New York.
What were your feelings about having this new father? Do you remember having any kind of feelings about this guy suddenly coming to the household?
No. I knew he was my stepfather. I knew my mother and father divorced. I was aware of that kind of thing. But I didn't have any, and my mother prepared the way. And he was very sweet in that sense. Remember, she said, he kept saying, "Where are my children? Where are my children?" And when she brought us back, he was over like
that. How was life? Okay, so you were up in New York. What part of?
Well, we lived in Queens, and then we moved to another part of Queens called Rockaway Point. Then we moved to, we moved from Queens to Brooklyn in a Virginia place, and then another area in Brooklyn called Park Place, not too far from Prospect Park in Brooklyn. Then we moved out to the beach, place called Rockaway Point, and then we moved back into Brooklyn and lived on East 37th Street.
Why all this moving? I mean, within what period of time was
Well, I think just to get better settled during the first year, and then when we moved out to the beach, we stayed there for 2 full years at least.
You say that was over a long time. For you, that was a long time.
Yeah, and that was wonderful because we had access to the beach during the summer. It was cold in the winter.
Mm-hmm.
We had for the first part of our lives on the beach, we had no hot water at all. I remember my father and a friend of his, my stepfather and a friend of his, putting in hot water pipes and then running them through this wood stove we had. And for the first time we had hot water in that place. It got damn cold during the winter.
Oh, I bet.
Used to freeze waiting for the school bus. We lived there for 2 years, and then we moved back into Brooklyn, and we had a house there and a nice yard and a neat area. And I was in the 4th grade then, and I was 9, and we lived there for about 8, 9, 10 months, and then we moved back to South Carolina.
What was your memories of your father then? I mean, being alcoholic and stuff, did the problems start getting worse then, or is it, was he just...
Never got any better. In some ways it was episodic, but it started by the time when she first married him, and it never really got any better.
Well, what was it? Did he abuse you?
No, not really.
So, he just got drunk and...
And verbally maybe. I don't like the word abuse. I think it's an overused word. But I think when Larry had too much to drink, he got very petulant, nasty, and critical, and sour, and and ugly for that matter. And so he took it out on us, and also my mother.
Well, did he ever beat her or anything like that? Do you know?
Only one time I remember. No, never remember it was actually hitting her. I remember one time when I was about 15. He was trying to. I came back from the movies. He was trying to break down her door. She'd locked herself in the bedroom, but as far as I knew, he'd never hit her.
So you were now back in South Carolina.
By the time I was 9.
And where did you say you moved back to Columbia? Or?
No, my sister was put with some friends, and I was put with my grandmother for 3 weeks. They moved back because they were looking for better jobs, and we wanted to move back to South Carolina. And so while my stepfather and mother were looking for jobs and getting settled, I think she'd already found a job, or he did, and finding a place to live. We spent several weeks in Andrews, South Carolina, and went to school there, and then we went on to Folly Beach, and we lived on Folly Beach for maybe a year and a half, which is near Charleston, about 12 miles from Charleston. And we lived in 3 different locations on Folly Beach.
A lot of this moving around again.
Yeah, well, we just, we found a place to live, and then we found a better place to live, and we moved there, and then I guess maybe the lease was up or something. We were always renting. We never owned a place.
Okay.
During that time. Mm-hmm. And then we moved from Folly Beach into Charleston itself, 68 Meeting Street, which is right that downtown area that my sister paints so much. Big, huge antebellum house. We lived up on the 3rd floor.
How did all this moving affect you as far as, did you seem to make,
It was hard.
I know that's a stupid
question. It was
question,
hard for a kid always walking into a classroom, in January or February. I remember the 4th grade, I went to about 3 different schools. And, I was in one school, and then I went to, when we were with my grandmother Andrews, I went to that school for grade school for about 3 weeks, and then we moved to Folly Beach. I went to a little country school called James Island School. And it's always hard being the new kid on the block. But, you get used to it.
So, okay, so you guys were in, what was it, the name of that downtown street? You were back in Charleston.
Meeting Street.
Meeting Street.
We lived there for 2 years. And then my stepfather got a job managing the Coca-Cola plant in Georgetown, South Carolina. So we moved to Georgetown, and that's the first time we ever actually bought a house. and we bought a big house on Broad Street, and we lived there for just 4 or 5 months, and then they sold it. My mother was working at the naval base in Charleston, and she was sort of commuting. She'd either come home several times a week and always come home on the weekends, but she would have had to drive over 70 miles just to get to work. So she stayed in Charleston most of the time during the week, and then would come home on the weekends. That wasn't working very well, and her job was, she had a good job. She was a GS-11 at the naval station, and I think they decided eventually we were going to have to move back to Charleston. So they sold the house, and I stayed with Larry, my stepfather, for a few weeks, and then my mother had taken an apartment in Ben Tillman Homes, and so I moved in with her until Larry could find a job back in Charleston. And I went to, I was in the 8th grade then. That was very traumatic because I really loved Georgetown. I love that small town. I love the small town atmosphere. You're a bigger fish in a smaller pond. I knew all the kids in school. I knew everybody in the school. I played in the band, and I really hated to leave. That was very upsetting. I had to do that. And of course, any kid 13 years old, as I've learned from raising my own kids, is very dependent upon friends and does not like to be dislocated. And whereas I might have been much more amenable at an earlier age, by the time you're an adolescent, it becomes much more traumatic for you. And I hated to leave. I was very unhappy to leave.
Let's back up a second. On your piano playing, I mean, we're getting out of where you're 13. When did you first start taking up piano?
I started playing, my mother bought that Baldwin piano, a little baby grand Baldwin, when I was about 8. I think it was 1941. And we had it at the beach when we lived at Rockaway Point. And I learned how to play on it by ear.
I mean, you just sat down and practiced?
Yeah, I just sat down and learned the keyboard, and I learned how to play by ear and pick up things. And then I'd hear some classic things, and I would imitate that. And I got familiar enough with the keys where I could play in different keys. And then when I was 12, I went to see a movie called A Song to Remember, which was about the life of Chopin. Very Hollywoodized, very melodramatic, but it was very well done musically. The soundtrack for the movie was done by a famous pianist at that time named Jose Iturbi. And I was enthralled by the music. I was so enthralled by the music that I told my mother I wanted to take piano lessons. I was 12. So that's when I started taking piano lessons.
It sounds almost like that's a magical age to be influenced because, John Fulton was like 13 when he saw that movie on bullfighting, and it just changed his whole life. I mean, I know you were already starting, but it seems like that was the final catalyst to propel you.
12 and 13 are ages of strong awareness.
Mm-hmm. So you were, for about 4 years, basically, from the time you were 8 till you were 12, you didn't have any lessons, but you were just doing it on your own.
I could play pretty well, yeah, on my own.
Well, that's very good. When did you have your first recital after you started taking lessons? You were 12 when you started taking lessons?
Well, I played in a recital of all the pupils the following year. I started taking, I guess, around September or so, 1945. And my teacher had presented all her pupils in a recital in May of 1946. So when I was 13, that was probably the first time that I heard.
But you were already pretty advanced, so it's not like...
Oh yeah, she pushed me. She pushed me, and I was, I think I played the first movement of a Beethoven sonata, and I'd only been taken 9 months. And I played it, probably the best I've ever performed publicly. I played it flawlessly. I didn't miss a note. And I was nervous as hell, but I played it very well.
What about the sight reading? I mean, as far as reading, from the time you were 8 to 12, you learned to do it on your own, but what about, did you pick up reading music actually?
Yeah, a little,
but I mean,
learned how
your
to
real
read
instruction then, and that began when you started getting lessons.
Yeah, and when I started taking lessons, I was doing advanced pieces, but with a very minimal expertise or minimal level of reading ability, and so that was hard. I memorized quickly, very quickly, but I struggled in reading. And she pushed me so fast that I was reading things that were really, I had to really work hard to grasp. But once I grasped them, then I memorized them very quickly.
So, okay, so we get back to where we were. Then you were about, let's see, where were you? It's when you were in 8th grade and you left Georgetown.
Well, we lived in Ben Tillman Homes for 3 or 4 years up in the North Charleston area, and I went to Chicora High School. I was in Chicora High School from the end of the 8th grade all the way up through the end of the 11th. And then...
And what was that like? I mean, did you like that, or was it a good
I
experience?
didn't particularly like the school. I had good friends that I was close to, but the school was kind of big, and it was kind of a very blue-collar area of Charleston. And in many ways, it was a rough school. But, you know, I got into a lot of things like any other kids in those age. And I had a lot of good friends, and I was very serious about my music then, so I did a lot of practicing. And I was in a lot of music contests and things of that sort. And then, and I didn't do badly. I think I didn't do badly academically. I wasn't very inspired by the place, but I kept up my grades at a decent level. And then my mother found a house. By that time,
wait. Hold on a sec. Just wait a minute.
Tell me.
We're on the air. Okay, so you were sitting there. You were talking about when you were in school and you weren't particularly thrilled with being in the school. You were there, I guess, like 3 years, and then your mother, you said, found a job elsewhere, but you were going to move, and that's when we stopped.
No, she didn't find another job. When I went to Chicora, she found a house in Mount Pleasant, and I was not enthusiastic about that move either because I was a junior in high school, a rising senior, and I wanted to graduate with the kids I knew. But you know, I didn't fight too much. I figured if necessary, I could commute and try to go back to my old school. So we moved, I think, toward the end of the year, sometime around April of 1950. She rented the house in Mount Pleasant. And then a couple of years later, they put it up for sale, so that's when she and Viv decided to buy it. So we moved there April or May of 1950.
Wait a minute, when did Viv come into the picture?
Well, Viv came into the picture sometime around 1945.
So you would have been about 12 or 13
years of age, yeah. She worked for my mother
so right
as
about
her assistant out at the Charleston Naval Shipyard, so they became very good friends. And so when my mother finally separated from Larry, and mother and I lived in the house my senior year in high school, and then I think when I went to the Citadel, Viv moved in with her, and they decided to buy the house together.
Okay, so I guess going back to then where you left, was it Chicora?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I went.
Is that where you went to? Did you go to Moultrie?
I went ahead and went to Moultrie my senior year.
I remember you telling a story a long time ago about how you talked to a guidance counselor and he said...
No, it was the superintendent. I told him I wanted to go back to Chicora and I needed his permission. And he was so emotionally, among other things, involved with that school, he thought that anybody who had the opportunity to go to Moultrie couldn't possibly pass it up. But he told me if I would give it a chance, if I would stay there 4 or 5 weeks, and then I still wanted to go to Moultrie, he would approve it. Or whatever it was, 3 weeks, which was good psychology. I've used that on a number of ways since then, but
my own kids
he had me, well, maybe my own kids, little freshman cadets who wanted to quit, things like that. Just stay with it for a few months or a few weeks and see how it goes. And so I did that, and it was a small class. There were only 35 in the class, and I really got to know the kids well, and I decided to stay and stay with that class and graduate.
So at this time, you'd been...
That was 1951, or 1950, 1950-51.
So where were you at this point in your music? In your...
At that time, I decided I'd had enough. I was taking speech class, one of the more influential classes I've ever had. We had a lot of debate, a lot of forensic type of exercises. We all had to do class presentations, speeches, extemporaneous things. And I really got into it. We discussed a lot of politics, and I decided then that I was a little tired of music. And so I wrote my music teacher and told her that I wanted to stop taking, that I had other interests at that time. And I did. I never took a lesson after that.
Are you serious?
Mm-hmm.
So how many years?
I was 17 then.
So you'd only been taking lessons, I guess, about 5 years then?
Yeah, I took lessons for 5 years.
So, at that point, I mean, you were, well, you said you were sick of the music. What, where did you see yourself going as far as a career or anything like that? Were you even thinking about that when you were?
Well, I was thinking about law, politics.
So you already...
I thought I might want to study law.
Oh, really? You considered like being a lawyer?
Yeah.
You didn't think, did the idea of working in the Foreign Service ever cross your mind?
Not at that point. I didn't even know what the Foreign Service was. But I just knew that I was interested in things like government and law. And so, but I was still interested in music, and I thought what I might do is go to the University of South Carolina and study pre-law and then minor in music or something of that sort. Those were my first inclinations.
So what made you decide to go to the Citadel as opposed to doing that original idea?
I'm not even sure, to tell you the truth. My mother was interested in the Citadel. I became interested in the Citadel because I knew they had a good political science department.
But it was a military school. I mean, surely there were other schools that had good political science departments. I guess it was convenient because it was also close by.
That was, yeah, and I knew a lot about the Citadel, and I liked the idea. I mean, I didn't know much about the cadet corps. I didn't know much about military life, but one of the other reasons was too that the Korean War had broken out in June of 1950, and so they were drafting, and this puts me in the same category as Bill Clinton or a lot of other people. I didn't want to get drafted. I wanted to go to college. I knew I could get a student deferment, and I figured if the war still lasted, then if I was going to serve, I wanted to get my education behind me and get a commission. And so the Citadel, because of its high commissioning rate and the good political science department, I figured I'd go in the service ultimately.
So in a way, you were kind of safe temporarily from the war. You could, not that you were trying to avoid.
I was
war,
never.
But if you were going to go in, you wanted to go ahead and get your education because you could have had it interrupted, and then when you came back.
Yeah, well,
I mean,
the main thing is I didn't want to go in the war as an enlisted man, and the Korean War was not like the Vietnam War ultimately became. It was much more of a patriotic war at the time. It wasn't the one that we wanted, and it interrupted a lot of older people's careers. But for the young fella, it wasn't the kind of thing that you resisted going in.
Mm-hmm.
And I just assumed that if the war weren't over, soon that ultimately I'd serve, and I'd want to serve as an officer. And if I was going to serve as an officer, I wanted a good commission.
So that was part of your reason for going to the Citadel.
Absolutely, yeah.
So then you entered the Citadel and you were there for 4 years. I mean, it was a 4-year program.
Right.
And how long before you became company commander?
Well, you can't be a company commander unless you're a senior.
Oh.
So I was promoted to cadet captain, and I was made commander of the same company I'd come up in.
How did you manage? I mean, what do you have to do that? I mean, what were the prerequisites, so to speak?
You mean to get promoted? A good record as a cadet. Not too many demerits. A good academic record. I had a very good academic record. And so overall, I was involved in different activities and things of that nature.
You had to know a lot of people, or at least be able to get along with them.
Oh yeah, that's.
I mean, if you're going to lead yeah. I mean, I've seen that, but that's a. What was that story about how you caught that guy who was stealing money from the other cadets? You used that powder.
Oh, I was a senior, and I strongly suspected him, and I'd heard some of my predecessors at the Citadel had used something called sneak thief powder, so I went down to the local police station with the permission of the Commandant of Cadets and got something called sneak thief powder, and we put it on money, on dollar bills, and put a few dollar bills in a wallet and planted it in a room that we suspected was going to be, you know, penetrated or whatever. And sure enough, and what happens is this: as soon as the powder hits any kind of moisture, and there's all kinds of moisture on your skin, it immediately turns a deep indigo and very difficult. It takes several days to get it out, and it gets all over clothes or towels, your face, and it's a telltale thing. And we caught him that way.
Well, what happened the next day when everybody lined up for in the morning on the?
Well, we don't do
quadrangle?
we didn't do things in those days, lying, cheating, stealing. We didn't drum people out of the Corps. They do it now, but that was after my time. They hold honor courts. They didn't have an honor court when I was there, and they in effect didn't have an honor system of such. And what happened in his case was that he was expelled from the college by the commandant, and there was no ceremony. He just quietly left.
Did he even try? Was he?
Well, he talked to me. He tried to get me to do something, and said his father had a bad heart, and there was no way I could have withdrawn anything and tried to help him. I mean, you can't have a thief like that among your midst. He wasn't a very good cadet, so you have to do those things sometimes.
What was your most memorable time, or the best time, or something say stands out the most from the time that you were the 4 years that you were there?
I can't think of any one particular time.
What are you the most proud of? Maybe the thing that you did while you were there, or that maybe just something that.
I can't think of any one thing. I had a good record there. I had a good academic record. I was proud because I was on the dean's list. On the dean's list, they call you had gold stars. You could wear them on your uniforms, on your dress uniforms, and that always made you stand out a little bit more. I was a member of the Round Table, which was kind of an exclusive discussion group, and I did represent the Citadel at a speech contest at Kings Point, New York, I guess my sophomore or junior year, on Abraham Lincoln. I don't know, I enjoyed being company commander because we were training the younger cadets.
Well, any incidents or anything like that stand out that kind of, any other interesting stories that are related to your being company commander that you remember?
No, I learned a lot about psychology. I remember one freshman cadet, his roommate called me into his room, and he was in a state of seizures, and said he couldn't move, and he was shaking and so forth. And so I calmed him down and got him to get up and walk and so forth. And I knew he was just going through some kind of a mental trauma. I had another one who used to cry all the time, and he was. I lost him. He eventually left because he was a kind of a mama's boy. He never could adapt, which was sad. I met with his mother and his sister, and he was a late born baby. In other words, his older sister was already 18 by the time he came along, and his sister said that she looked at me and she said, no, his mother looked at me and said, when that boy was born, it was like Jesus Christ coming into the world. And the commandant and I looked at each other and kind of rolled our eyes, and what can you do? He never went to camp. He never was away from home. He didn't tie his shoes until he was, maybe 8 or 9 years old, because he always had a black nursemaid running around after him. And what can you do with somebody like that? But it was interesting. We did a lot of things. We did some rather innovative things, I think, and trying to keep the system going.
Meaning what?
Well, I used to go over to, I used to check out their academic and some of their background records just so I knew a little bit more about the cadets, and which I don't think any other company commander did, so that I would have a kind of a feel for the character of the person, especially somebody who was having problems.
Sort of like Ross Perot, you checked into their background.
Well, no, I just went into school files to see whether there was anything I could. It was more to try to help them than to exclude them from anything.
No, I know. I was just joking.
Yeah.
So then you graduated in You had a commission, you went into the Air Force.
No, I graduated at a Fulbright scholarship, and I went to France to study.
Okay, so and that was for 1 year to Strasbourg?
Right. And I also had a couple of scholarships to graduate school. And I accepted one at Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. So when I finished my year in France, I went directly to graduate school in Medford, Massachusetts.
What did you study? I mean, tell us a little bit about what you did in Strasbourg. I mean, what was the purpose of that?
Oh, I mainly enrolled in the French Institute for Foreigners and mainly studied French literature and French language, French culture, that sort of thing.
Why did you choose to do this? I mean, did you think that later on you'd be working somehow with the French?
Well, by that time, I was very definitely interested in the Foreign Service, and I was interested in going overseas and maybe studying overseas. And I had a professor who encouraged me to apply for the Fulbright.
Does the Fulbright only send you to Strasbourg, or there are other places you could
all
go?
over the world.
So I'm just wondering why you picked France. You must have had some interest.
Because I was studying French. I had been studying French. I didn't want to go to an English-speaking place.
Why not opposed to Germany but you?
Well, I hadn't studied German.
So
I had studied French all the way through college.
Okay, so that was the main motivator.
Yeah, right. And I even asked my French professor I had to select 3 places where I might study, and he made some suggestions, and on the basis of his suggestions, I made my 3 selections. And I think Strasbourg, Strasbourg, can't remember the other 2 right now. Anyway, you had 3, you could suggest 3 places, and then the Fulbright committee would pick one. You suggested 1 and 2 alternates, as I recall. And Grenoble, that was one of the other ones, and I got Strasbourg.
So Strasbourg was your first choice?
I don't remember. I just remember making 3 choices. Probably Paris was my first choice. I probably chose Paris, Strasbourg, and Grenoble, and I got Strasbourg.
So what did they pay, like your tuition and expenses?
Everything.
Wow.
Everything. Tuition, spending money, books, and the spending money was very generous so that you could travel, you could use it to travel, and also your passage over and back on the Queen Mary, Queen Elizabeth.
Well, did they have, it's going to seem really dumb, but did they have any kind of jetliners at that time?
No,
or they were just hadn't come out with them yet?
No,
jets, so that was a typical way to travel.
Jets didn't come out until at least another 10 years.
Really, that's right, because that was back in 50...
Well, no, maybe 6. Well, this was 55. The first commercial jets, I think, came online in the very late 50s. And the first commercial jet I ever took was 1962, so I'm exaggerating. The commercial jets were on maybe 6-7 years later.
So that was kind of the typical way to travel, was on the Queen Mary or some kind of a ship like that.
Yeah, they had overseas flights. They were on something like DC-6s, DC-4s.
So while you were in Strasbourg, I remember this is when you did your traveling where you all rented that car and went down to Italy and...
No, we rented a car. When we rented the car, we went to Spain and then crossed over and spent a day in Tangier, Morocco, and then came back up. And that was during Easter vacation. We took a train to Italy for Christmas vacation.
Were these other Americans, or Frenchmen you were studying?
Well, the first trip I think there were 3 of us. And a girl went with us, I guess. Trying to remember. 3 or 4 of us, and then we met a guy who was in the Army on one of the trains, and he went along with us too, and we had a good time. And then when we went to Spain during Easter, there were 5 of us who rented a car from Strasbourg.
So after you got back from Strasbourg, well, first, anything that stands out that you remember particularly that you really enjoyed about being there that 1 year? Was it the highlight, the trip, maybe, or?
I don't know, everything. Going across on the ships was a wonderful experience. Going back on the ships was a wonderful experience. The travel we were able to do, the friends we made, I don't know, there was nothing 1 or 2. It was just, it was very educational. I was the only one Probably the one thing that stands out in that sense is I was the only one in my whole group in Strasbourg who was from the Deep South. And we had a lot of problems at that time. We had a lynching of a 15-year-old kid in Mississippi or someplace, and that became very, very a notorious event worldwide. And so I was always, and there was a great deal of interest among the French in the racial situation in the United States. So I was always being called on to present the Southern point of view. And so in that sense, I was, it was kind of a challenge, but I enjoyed it. I think I made, some good inroads in that sense.
Was there anything that you learned about the French that maybe you weren't expecting, or anything? Did you have any, say, preconceived notions before you went over there that were either dispelled or confirmed?
That's a good question, and I don't know how to answer it. I went over with pretty much of an open mind. I guess the main thing that I found interesting was how immobile societies are over there and how structured they are. And well, it's just that class in Great Britain and in France and other places, class and elitism are very much part of the fabric of society. And so I had a friend, for instance, whose family had a big estate, and it was quite proper for him to get a job working in a bank because that was acceptable. Whereas, for instance, while I was working during college, I worked on a Coca-Cola truck, I delivered telegrams, I put up fences, I did all kinds of jobs, and things that people like that would never been able to do because of society. It just wasn't done. And so in a sense the upper middle and upper classes were very structured in that sense and very elitist. The educational system is very elitist. It was it's difficult for, I think it was difficult for a lot of the students to have any kind of regular contact on an undergraduate level, for instance, with their professors. There was this very strange kind of distant relationship between students and professors. The education system was very very austere in the sense that the classes and lectures were held, and at the end of the year you were examined on everything. You had oral and written examinations. And a lot of the French students never turned in papers, never had to do anything until that final run on exams, and the exams were everything.
Sounds like law school, basically.
Yeah, probably. Yeah, I don't know how they grade during the year at law school, but in France, and I think this is probably true of other systems in Europe, everything depended upon how well you did in May. So a lot of the kids would go to class, take notes, so they could even buy the lectures, but they never studied until after Easter, and then they really, really studied. And I'm talking mostly of liberal arts types of things.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, sciences are a little different. But I found it, and the educational system very elitist oriented. It did not accommodate the late bloomer type person. I tutored a kid, for instance, who was going into what they call the 6th grade or the 6th level, and he was going to take tests which would decide whether he would go into the regular high school baccalaureate program or go into a more commercial or general type of program. And this would separate him for the rest of his life from a career standpoint. And that was, to me, there are a lot of 12 or 13-year-olds or 12-year-olds who just don't come on their own until they get to be, say, 14. And by that time they would have been bypassed by the very, very rigid track system that they have. And and I had graduated from college where I had fellows drop out as a freshman to go into the service and come back on the GI Bill, and they made much, much better grades later on than they would have had they stayed in school.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, they were flunking out. And I always felt that our system was very flexible, that it accommodated people who got their act together a little bit later in life than others. And whereas the very rigid European system doesn't. And I think that sets this country apart. And I noticed that. That was one of the striking things that I observed while I was there.
So then you came back, and that's when you went to Medford, Massachusetts.
That's when I went to graduate school. Right.
Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy.
Right.
How long were you there?
A year. Got my MA. And then I went into the service. So that was from September of '56 to June of 57, and then July '57 I went into the Air Force for 3 years.
Why didn't you say go into the Air Force first, and then get your master's? And then say go into the Foreign Service while you still be fresh?
I thought it was more logical to get the studies behind me.
Oh, because you didn't know if you might start a family or something.
Well, I never knew anything what was going to happen, but I always felt that get school behind you first, and they were willing to defer me and hold my commission while I was studying.
Oh, you're talking about the Air Force?
Yeah.
Okay, so they held your commission for 2 years.
Yeah.
In Strasbourg, and then.
And then at Fletcher. And then when I went to the Air Force, I had all my studies behind me, you see. And when I went into the Air Force, I had already taken the Foreign Service examination, and so the written and the oral, and they told me that they would defer my appointment until I finished the service.
Everything was getting deferred.
Yeah, so I went in. Then I ended my service deferment, went into the service, and then when I finished in the service in 1960, I went into the State Department.
So tell me a little bit about the Air Force. I mean, you were in there for 3 years.
Yeah, I was. I spent the first 4, 5, 6 months as an intelligence officer, what they call photo radar officer, and I had absolutely no training for it, so I had to learn on the job, and became an editor to edit things, and then our squadron adjutant is basically, he was a director of administrative services for the squadron. We had a big squadron. About 300 airmen and about 50 officers. It was because we were a very highly technical outfit that we were so top heavy with commission rank. We had lieutenants and captains and majors and so forth. And our squadron commander was a full colonel. And I was called in to be his more or less assistant and adjutant for the next 2.5 years. So I got an overall overview of everything in the squadron. And I pretty much ran all of the administration of the squadron, and had a lot of additional things, top secret control officer, this and that and the other for the squadron.
Where were you
I worked
stationed?
directly for the commander at Westover Air Force Base, Massachusetts.
You were there the entire 3 years?
Except for a 3-week TDY to Texas to learn how to went to a school, an intelligence school for making certain types of training materials. Well, it was more than that, I guess. Training materials for some of the work we did in our squadron.
So, what kind of stands out as far as the 3 years that you were there? What was maybe the highlight of being in the Air Force?
Ooh, I don't know. There was no particular highlight. I would have enjoyed going overseas to someplace, but I was pretty much stuck there. It was good fun working, for the squadron commander, and I had made some good friends. I shared a house with 3 other guys, and pretty much for the whole time. It was a very demanding sort of thing because we were one of the numbered air forces of strategic air command, and we were always having alerts being called in to, as simulated exercises in case of war. So, and we were always being tested, and you're always under a great deal of pressure. But it was fun. I mean, we really you learned a lot about military service discipline, getting the job done, priorities, that sort of thing.
So after you were in the Air Force, Then you immediately went right into the
I
foreign
had a
service.
month. I had a month, and then I reported into the State Department in August.
Is that when you started training for taking your Spanish classes, or the?
No, I had French because of my college French and the French that I had learned overseas. It was rusty. They put me in an accelerated French course after the basic, what they call the basic course, and the basic course lasted I think 8 weeks, and our class ended, well maybe more, but anyway, when our class ended, I went into in October, and I immediately went into French training, and I finished French training in January, and then I was assigned to the Bureau of Intelligence and Research, working on Western European matters. And then I got a chance to, well, I had several opportunities. One was to go to, they had an opening in Hawaii, and I was to go in a Hawaii reception center, and I turned that down because I wanted something more substantive. And then they had an opening on the Africa desk, so I'd spent 6 months in that Bureau of Research, Intelligence Research, and I went down on the Congo desk in the African Bureau. I worked there for another year or so. And then, in the meantime, I was a bachelor, so I decided it'd be good to learn another language. I didn't have any, I didn't have any outside encumbrances or anything, so I enrolled in the early morning Spanish class, which at the Foreign Service Institute started at 7:30 in the morning and then went till 9:15, and then you went to your regular job. So I'd get up early in the morning and I'd go to my Spanish class and then go to work, and then get off from work and whatever, and then maybe study my Spanish and the lessons at night and so forth. And that's where I met your mother.
Did you, just going back, say, to your time in the Air Force and also the Foreign Service, did you practice the piano, or did you kind of keep up your music during this time? Did you have access to a piano?
To a certain extent. In the Air Force, I got an old beat up upright from an Army major, an Air Force major in our squadron. So I had that at the house, but I just used that. I used that to do a little bit of stuff with. And I was in the chapel, the Protestant chapel choir for that full 4 years. And then when I went into the State Department, I had a little small apartment in Georgetown. I had no piano there. And when we went to Nicaragua on our first overseas post, we rented a piano from the landlord. So I had the piano, a little spinet. We have a picture of you sitting at it. I had it there, and then when we went to Africa for 3 years, I didn't have a piano at all.
Yeah, well, get into that later. I think we'll go ahead and